Right. Well, welcome back, everyone, for the next session of the day, where we will shift our gaze from the, in some ways, familiar territory of Europe to the Indo-Pacific, which will contain an increasingly significant percentage of the global economy, and where the structure of alliances is in some ways a much more uncertain question. The academic Stephen Walton, possibly the seminal work on alliances and international relations, once noted that geography is, amongst other things, one of the key determinants of alliance cohesion. It's something we, in some ways, take for granted, but also ignore when we talk about global interests. At least some of the cohesion we've seen in the response to Russia is a product of the fact that what's happening is geographically proximate to us. But what happens when alliances have to operate at reach? What happens in a theater like the Indo-Pacific? Does Western cohesion retain its current structure at these distances? Or is this the sort of area in which we see divergent national interests and strategies really bubble to the fore? More importantly, what is the optimal way to engage partners in the Indo-Pacific? Are formal alliances the best way to do this in a part of the world where actually multilateral frameworks like NATO haven't existed? Alliances have often been of a bilateral hub and spoke model, or have not existed at all and have instead been substituted by alignments and strategic partnerships and less formal modes of engagement. And how exactly should the boundaries of the defensive perimeter and the alliance frameworks we think about in the Indo-Pacific, how should they be drawn? Should they, as the current President of the United States believes, be drawn on the basis of values? And if they are, can they accommodate a number of autocratic partners or quasi-democratic partners who may actually share many of our interests? Or should we perhaps think of alliances in more interest-based terms, in terms of defending the status quo rather than setting them up on the basis of values? These and other questions will be the subject of this panel's discussion, and I'm delighted to be joined by two very distinguished speakers who will be holding forth on the subject. First up, we will have Dr. Eugene Kogan, who researches negotiations, leadership, and crisis diplomacy at Harvard Business School. Dr. Kogan was previously a project director at the American Secretaries of State project. Second, we will have Dr. Antoine Bondaz, who heads up the Taiwan and Korea, who directs the Taiwan and Korea projects at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. Dr. Bondaz is an expert on matters of East Asian geopolitics, the foreign and security policies of nations such as the PRC, the Koreas, and Taiwan, and as a deep engagement with the subject both on an academic basis and as an advisor to policymakers and the private sector. So first of all, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this panel. As with previous panels, we will have two brief 10-minute interventions before a Q&A session where you, the audience, can play a more interactive role. And with that, I will turn over to Eugene to lead us off. Eugene, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Sidharth, and good afternoon, Antoine, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person. So greetings from Boston, where I would welcome you anytime. It's a beautiful time to be in the northeast of the United States. Let me start with a word of thanks to Antoine and in particular to Eugene and her wonderful team in the English department who have been wonderful hosts and warm and welcoming hosts for me over the last few years. And so I'm happy to be back at this symposium. I only have 10 minutes to speak, and usually I'm not that brief. I usually take about 15 minutes to introduce myself, so the time works against me today. So I will try to be brief, but as a cost of brevity, I might be only slightly provocative. And if I'm provocative, you will forgive me because I'm doing it for a productive purpose, to generate the discussion and to cut through the smoke and get to the fire. Let me make two opening kind of scene-setting remarks, one substantive and one personal, and then I'll come to my three substantive points that I really want to make in this presentation. The two scene-setting remarks, one is I just want to acknowledge the humanitarian horror that is happening in Ukraine as we speak. And I acknowledge it with a heavy heart because the presentation of my substantive remarks today will be fairly academically clinical in nature, seemingly setting aside the humanitarian consequences of the things we're discussing. But I just want to acknowledge that that they are taking place. The second one is a more personal one, and this is kind of old cards on the table moment. So I'm a Jewish refugee from Moscow, where I left 25 years ago, never to return. And so I look at the subject matter that we study today with a heavy heart, both academically heavy heart and personally heavy heart. Academically, because growing up studying international relations, I, for one, maybe like many of you, never imagined to be discussing all-out ground war in the heart of Europe. So this is, and then personally, obviously, with my paternal ancestors from eastern Ukraine, this is personally quite impactful for me. Having set aside those two introductory remarks, however, I just want to make 3 points in the 7 or whatever minutes that I have left. And the 3 points would be one on the nature and definition of credibility. The second one about perceptions. And the third one about love. Now, bear with me, please. Give me the benefit of the doubt. I realize that the word love is the last word you were expecting to hear at École de Guerre. And you think I've lost my marbles, and you're probably right. That happened a long time ago. But bear with me, and hopefully I can make the case to you that that's an appropriate word to be talking about today. Let me start with credibility. Again, forgive me for my curtness, but in the interest of time, I just want to get straight to the point. I am, for the lack of a better word, often irked by the lack of clarity on what credibility stands for in the discussions of alliance dynamics today, whether they're in Indo-Pacific or in Europe. The conversation often revolves around capabilities that states have versus one another. That, for example, I often hear Vladimir Putin, for example, would never think about attacking a NATO country because the preponderance of nuclear power that NATO has versus Russian capabilities. Capability is only one part that makes up what makes credibility effective. Credibility is a function of capability and resolve. Resolve to use the capabilities that we have. And I hope, in today's discussion, I hope maybe going forward, we can have a little bit more both linguistic but also strategic clarity about what makes alliances credible, what makes threats credible, what makes incentives credible. It has to do to a large extent about the resolve we have to use the capabilities we actually possess. That's a quick point number one. From credibility, I want to get to perceptions. I am struck by the overwhelming narrative. At least I'm well familiar with the narrative on this side of the Atlantic in the United States about how the Russia-Ukraine war is proceeding, and the narrative overwhelmingly talking about how Russia is losing the war, how it is losing the war tactically, strategically, losing battle after battle. I'm reminded as I listen to this gentlemen, and invite commentary and I'm happy to stand corrected in this, but Zhou Enlai during the 1970s, the Chinese premier, was famously asked what he thought of the French Revolution. And his reply was caustic but memorable, right? It's too early to tell. And it's interesting to say this to an audience in Paris, France, obviously. What I'm getting at is that perceptions take hold over a long period of time. And I hope we don't draw too early conclusions and perhaps mistaken conclusions, because from my perspective, and I told you I would be slightly provocative, so here it comes. I think that Russia is conducting a masterclass in nuclear impunity. If I am sitting now in Beijing, or in Taipei, or for that matter in Canberra, this is a masterclass in how the West, however you would like to define it, the Western world, the major European countries, and obviously the United States of America, are approaching the situation where a nuclear-armed aggressor is behaving towards a non-nuclear-armed target. And this is a larger question that I'm happy to discuss on how leaders make conclusions or inferences about future actions or future reactions by allied countries. And here, I want to be very clear, I don't want to get bogged down in the discussion of whether Ukraine is technically an ally or whether Taiwan is technically an ally, let's say from the US perspective. Let's say how a nuclear-armed aggressor is behaving towards a friendly, non-nuclear armed state, so that I don't get caught in the language bind here that this is not really a NATO member, this is really, we don't have a real alliance commitment to protect Ukraine. The issue is perception. And I'm willing again to debate with you, if you are interested, how perceptions are shaped in international relations, because as Mike Mansfield, the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Japan, once observed, perceptions are reality in international relations. So let me come then to the third point. I'm sure you've been wondering, what is this love issue that I am referring to? No, I'm not referring to romantic love. I had the great pleasure earlier in my career to meet Steve Bosworth, the late Ambassador Bosworth, who was ambassador to South Korea and the Philippines and worked a lot on the North Korea nuclear issue, and he was later dean at Tufts here in Boston and a professor at Harvard. And he said to me in one of the conversations, he said, you know, Eugene, our allies have an I love you problem. And I sat back a little bit, sort of wondering, where is he going with this? And he said, you understand, no matter how much we tell them we love them, they have trouble believing, they have trouble being reassured that we in fact will stand by them when time comes. And so as I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to share with you two short sentences. One from 1963, spoken by John F. Kennedy in West Berlin. And one in 2022, spoken by, obviously, Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. And John F. Kennedy said, all free men, he should have added women, all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. This was 1963, and these were not just empty words. And in 2022, President Zelensky said, the West, recently if you listen to his 60 Minutes interview, this is a program in the US, TV program, he said the West has to supply weapons, and I'm quoting, supply weapons to Ukraine as if they were defending themselves and their own people. Similar types of sentiment that, for me, synthesizes the key issue of alliance management today and alliance definition today is at what point, or as my favorite professor in college, Bill Rose, used to say, under what conditions? Under what conditions, I leave you with this question, can you and I, and citizens of the West, imagine becoming citizens of Taipei? Truly becoming, feeling like we are all Taiwanese now, right? Because that time might come when that might become actually actionable. And so those two, that dynamic of feeling like we owe it, or we have that commitment on which we, not owe it, but we have that commitment to defend, to act on that sense of citizenship, united citizenship, I think is key to our discussion, which I look forward to having, about the nature of alliances in Indo-Pacific and more broadly as well. Thanks very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that, Eugene. I think a lot of important points covered there, particularly the idea of strategic momentum and perceptions, which I hope we get to revisit in the Q&A session. But with that, I'll turn over to you, Antoine, for our second intervention.
Thank you very much. It's a very broad issue because the title Dying for Taiwan, and there's so many questions. It's quite interesting. I'll try to focus mostly on the Indo-Pacific, the question of alliances, of credibility, etc. The very first aspect on the Indo-Pacific is how do you build an ocean? And how do you make sure, first, that from a European perspective, people start identifying to the Indo-Pacific? It was a long-term process. As you know, the French were the first one within the EU to adopt the term in 2018, followed by the Germans and the Dutch in 2020, and then it was at the EU level in 2021. So it took time, first, to even accept and agree on a common notion. Second, we don't have the same definition of the Indo-Pacific among different countries. We have a common definition at the EU level because we have an EU strategy for cooperation, so we had to agree. But let's go to Australia, let's go to Japan, let's go to India, let's go to the US. The five of us all share different definition of what Indo-Pacific is. So the first element is how do you build a notion, and then how do you build a consensus? How do you make sure that the Europeans feel like they have huge interest in the Indo-Pacific and that they might have to fight for it and even to die for it? The European interest in the Indo-Pacific are very different according to where you're looking from. The French perspective on the Indo-Pacific is unique within the EU. And it will never be, I would say, the average perspective, or even the perspective from which you can start negotiating with the other EU partners. Because the French have, as you all know, sovereignty interest in the region. We have 1.6 million French people living in French overseas territories, 90% of the exclusive economic zones, more than 7,000 soldiers permanently deployed, etc. That's the case of strictly no other EU member state. So we cannot expect, for sure, the other EU member state to align or even come closer to the French perspective. So once again, the question is, how do you build a consensus? How do you find the key issues, the key areas in which we all agree that we have common interest? We have, of course, a very minimal definition of our common interest. It's going to be everything that is, let's say, non-political, trade, science and technology, culture, environmental security, etc. And on the security perspective, it's mostly non-traditional security. So we talk a lot about maritime security with no capabilities to implement it, let's be honest, except the French and the British. It's one thing for the German to send a frigate to the Indo-Pacific, great. It's a nice political gesture. On the military level, it doesn't mean anything. It's not going to change anything. So we have a problem on that. Key question is, what is the added value at the EU level in terms of security? If you check what will be the Czech presidency in the next semester of the presidency of the Council of the EU, the Czech have decided to focus on 3 areas. There are environment, cybersecurity, and space. Cybersecurity might be one of the areas in which the EU as a whole, not the member state, but the EU as a whole, might have some form of added value. One of the key questions we have, once again, is how do you build a notion, how do you build a consensus, and how do you agree on where we have an added value and where we're ready to commit, to engage maybe more than before. And of course, it raised the question of the convergence of interests that was mentioned in the question. So far, we have limited convergence of interests among the Western countries. It's one thing to say that there is a strong transatlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, etc., that we have growing interest, common interest, growing convergence. We do, sure. We have never discussed that much China at the transatlantic level or the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we discuss China even at the EU TTC, the Trade and Tech Council between the US and EU, is something quite new. It's very positive, etc., but it's still very limited. And it was one of the impact, if you see what happened in September with AUKUS, you know, when the French tried to get the EU support. We were kind of satisfied with the President of the Council and the President of the Commission making like one very small sentence saying that, oh yeah, the Australians should have not done that. But the reality is that most of the EU countries didn't care. And the French were quite isolated on that. From the Czech perspective, from the Swedish perspective, from the Polish perspective, we were quite isolated. And that's another issue. It's like we don't have enough convergence as a Western, let's say, perspective on the Indo-Pacific. And if we do have convergence in terms of trade, maritime security, once again with Australia, with Japan, with the US, in terms of military, we don't. That's why, you know, when the question is dying for Taiwan, we are not dying for Ukraine. Why would the Europeans go die for Taiwan? I mean, let's be very honest. I mean, I've been living in Taiwan. I'm working with Taiwanese on every day, etc. But that's not what they expect. And sometimes they are maybe a bit more pragmatic than we are. The question is not whether the Europeans are going to go die for Taiwan. They won't. They're not dying for Ukraine. You expect them to go die for Taiwan when they don't even have the capabilities to project forces. What we could do in Ukraine, it's even complicated, but still, we cannot do it in Taiwan. So that's one thing for the French, to have some navy, some planes, etc., to project some forces, but the Europeans cannot. So they're not going to go die for Taiwan. So then the key question is, what can the Taiwanese and the American and the Japanese, the Australian can expect from us? And what is, once again, our added value? The added value we can have is not in intervening in a conflict, you know, kind of, you know, I'm participating in plenty of track 1.5 brainstorming session on what would happen if there is a contingency in Taiwan, etc. It's great, you know, to have all these think tankers, you know, to discuss what would happen if none of them have a military background. None of them have the sense of the reality of what is possible, of what is not. And the reality that the Europeans cannot project forces in the Taiwan Strait. The French can, maybe, limited, very limited. Do we have an interest in doing so? The will to do so, I doubt it. So the added value we have in the contingency in Taiwan is to prevent it. And that's what we need to move, and that's what we need to do more. For years, the strategy was to invisibilize Taiwan. No one wanted to talk about Taiwan. No think tank, even in Europe, even in the UK, even in France, would not dare to talk about Taiwan. Because, you know, you would get the Chinese embassy to call you and complain, etc. And what would you get out of it? Nothing. So the first thing is we need to start talking about Taiwan. We need to start thinking about a contingency. And if you don't start talking about it, how do you want even to be able to act on anything? Second is what can we do on a concrete term to prevent a conflict? We need to raise a cost in terms of calculus from the Belgian perspective, from the Chinese perspective on the cost of intervening in Taiwan. We failed in Ukraine. And we need to assess the situation. We failed in deterring Russia. We failed in convincing Russia that the cost would be too high. Maybe they acknowledge it now, but it's kind of too late because, of course, there is a war already. So one of the key questions from the European and especially Western perspective is, how do you agree on convincing China that the cost is too high to unilaterally change by force the status quo? And on that aspect, the Europeans have some leverages in terms of diplomatic, in terms of economic aspects, etc. And Ukraine, in a way, is a good case study. Do the Chinese consider the Europeans credible? And I will conclude on the issue of credibility. Not yet. They were surprised, just like the Europeans themselves, on the extent of the sanctions. But they also see that, some very big countries like Germany are not delivering the weapons they could have to Ukraine. That in terms of the sanctions that cost us a lot, in terms of oil and gas, we're not taking them yet. And China feels pretty confident that even though there is unprecedented cohesion, we are not going that far. And you need a bit more to deter the Chinese to not next year or in 2 years, but in 10, 15, 20 years, not to try to conquer, in a way, Taiwan. And the question of credibility is very important because from the Chinese perspective, the key objective is to do everything to erode credibility. Everything you see in the Chinese press, in the Chinese official speeches, is to erode the US credibility. Afghanistan, in August, was covered in the Chinese press, and in the Russian press, but in the Chinese press, as a symbol and as an example of the lack of US credibility. What's happening in Ukraine is also a message being sent to the Taiwanese from the Chinese. Of course, it's not completely true, but the idea that, they are not intervening in Ukraine. Of course, they won't come for you. And the key question from the Chinese is, first, how to erode credibility, and how to make sure, and I will conclude on that alliances do not materialize, and that network of alliances does not materialize in Asia. After AUKUS, just the day after AUKUS, I published an op-ed, not in France because I would have been criticized too much, but in Politico on, the silver lining of AUKUS is that it's a very bad news from China. When, most people in France would say, AUKUS is a good thing for China, it's a wonderful opportunity. I don't see why, but that's a wonderful opportunity for China because they will divide the Westerners, etc. It's a bad news for China. The nightmare, the strategic nightmare from the Chinese perspective is to have a multilateralization of alliances in the region. You have a set of bilateral alliances. If you start having multilateralization of alliances, AUKUS is not per se an alliance, but it's being seen from the Chinese perspective as a first step toward multilateralization. What's next? Japan to join it? AUKUS to be more than a partnership, but to transform into an alliance? For a so-called Asian NATO, not for NATO, to expand to Asia. That's not the discussion they have in China. It's to have an Asian NATO, not to have NATO going to Asia, but mostly to have an Asian NATO, to have a multilateralization of the US, Japan, and the Republic of Korea alliance, to have a multilateralization with Australia, etc. And once again, from the Chinese perspective, and that's quite interesting, and I will conclude on that, I promise, it's the Chinese will do everything to avoid that scenario. They are pretty confident that they can avoid and convince the Korean not to join, and that they can kind of neutralize South Korea. They are not very confident with Japan, with Australia, and with some other EU countries, including the UK. And one of the big challenges from the Chinese perspective is that. What the credibility first of the US in the region, and second, will the US be able to multilateralize this alliance? And you can multilateralize this alliance only if we see a convergence of interests, and only if the Europeans, the Japanese, the Australians, and other countries in the region consider that we have kind of a converging perception of what is a region, what are our interests, and that one country is willing to change the status quo by force. As long as you don't have this convergence, the Chinese feel pretty confident, as they have been over the last 2 decades, that they can avoid it.
Well, thank you very much, both.